It begins with a professor named John Oldman, packing his belongings onto his truck, preparing to move to a new home. His colleagues show up unexpectedly to give him a surprise farewell party. Harry, a biologist. Edith, a devout Christian and art historian. Dan, the level-headed anthropologist. Sandy, the loving historian with feelings she won't admit. Later joins Art, a cynical archaeologist. And young Linda, a curious student. John's colleagues press him to explain why he's suddenly leaving after a decade as a professor. To their surprise, he calmly replies that he's done this many times before. Dan shockingly responds that John is far too young to have done this before. Edith adds that John hasn't aged a single day in the past 10 years. John says he simply likes to move on from time to time, it's just a personal thing. They discovered a burin made from a parrot beak, an extremely rare artifact from the early Magdalenian period in John's apartment. Being intrigued, they asked him about it. To their surprise, John responded with a hypothetical question. What if a man had lived for 14,000 years? They play along at first, treating it as nothing more than an intellectual exercise, a philosophical game. Henry remarks that, hypothetically speaking, it is possible if the body could achieve perfect regeneration of its cells, particularly in the vital organs. He explains that the human body is, in theory, designed to live up to 190 years, but most people succumb prematurely due to the gradual accumulation of toxins from food, water, and air. The pancreas regenerates its cells every 24 hours, the stomach lining every 3 days, and the entire body undergoes cellular renewal approximately every 7 years. However, the process is imperfect. Over time, waste accumulates, cellular functions degrade, and the system eventually fails. But if a rare anomaly in the immune system enabled flawless detoxification and cellular renewal, then yes, it could happen. As the conversation deepens, John stuns everyone by quietly revealing that he is that man, the one who has lived for 14,000 years. They laugh at him. But John isn't smiling. He's not joking. He tells everyone that every 10 years when people start to notice he isn't aging, he moves on. He was born in the Paleolithic era. He stopped aging at 35. Over time, his companions began to suspect he was draining their lives to preserve his youth, so he kept moving on, always changing groups to protect his secret. He has lived through the rise and fall of civilizations. From Magdalenian caves to Mesopotamian ziggurats. From being a Sumerian for 2,000 years, to wandering east as a disciple of the Buddha. In the East he studied under the Buddha himself, remaining by his side until the Buddha's death. As John laid out his unbelievable story with unnerving clarity and conviction, Art's disbelief turned to fury. Disturbed by the possibility that John actually believed it all, he snapped, and called in Dr. Gruber, convinced his friend was descending into madness. Dr. Will Gruber, the psychiatrist, allows John to continue carefully observing him to assess his mental state. John resumes his extraordinary tale. John speaks of sailing with Columbus, witnessing Vincent van Gogh spiral into madness. He even claims to possess one of Van Gogh's paintings, given to him as a gift. All the while, he calmly and convincingly counters every challenge his friends throw at him, deflecting their skepticism with unsettling ease. But Will isn't just analyzing John, he is grieving. His wife died that very morning. Suddenly, their conversation shifts. It's no longer just about time, it's about loss. About watching everyone you love grow old and die. Will confronts him, pushing deeper. He asks, "Do you feel guilt? Regret?" John's answer is quiet, almost distant. His memories, he says, are fragmented, not recalled as history, but as moments lived. But by that point his friends are no longer trying to debunk him. They are intrigued. Curiosity replaces skepticism. They urge him to go on. So he does. Gradually their conversation turns toward God and creation. Being curious, they ask if John has ever met anyone from religious history. Or if he might be someone they know from the Bible but never suspected. John hesitates. He tries to deflect, to change the subject. But they won't let it go. They press him, demanding answers. Art argues that much of the Bible is myth and allegory, with perhaps a few historical events woven in. Linda asks him directly if he might be Moses. John responds thoughtfully, saying that Moses was likely based on Mesis, a figure from Syrian mythology. He points out how earlier versions of the myth all include themes floating on water. The mythical overlay around these stories is so vast, but the truth is far simpler than the stories suggest. They asked him about Jesus. To their surprise, John tells them he once met the Buddha and admired his teachings. 500 years later, he returned to the Mediterranean, lived as an Etruscan, and eventually found himself in the Roman Empire, a regime that turned into a giant killing machine. So he traveled to the Near East and thought, why not pass on the Buddha's message in a modern form? So he tried. But he was just one dissident in the eyes of Rome, and Rome crushed him. The rest became a legend. During the crucifixion he used techniques learned in India and Tibet to block pain, and slow his body functions until they were undetectable. His followers believed he was dead, placed him in a cave, and when he recovered and emerged, they thought he had risen from the dead. He tried to explain, but they were already convinced. So he fled to Central Europe to escape the myth building around him. When Art asked to see his scars, John replied he doesn't scar. Besides, the Romans tied him, they didn't nail him. That part was a religious exaggeration. He also added that the Jesus story was borrowed from earlier myths. For example, virgin birth like Alcmene, divine fathers like Zeus, all recycled into something new. At this point, Edith, deeply devoted in her Christian faith, was visibly offended and grew angry. But Harry and Dan seemed to be leaning the other way, starting to believe John or at least seriously consider his claims. Harry pointed out that many Christian stories bear striking similarities to older pagan myths. Dan added that much of the philosophy attributed to Jesus closely mirrors Buddhist teachings, just delivered with a Hebrew accent. He pointed out that values like kindness, tolerance, brotherhood, and love, as well as a pragmatic acceptance of life as it is in the present moment, are central to both teachings. Even the concept of the kingdom of God could be understood as a metaphor for human goodness existing here on earth. He concluded that this perspective, the idea of constantly becoming, evolving, was at the heart of what the Buddha originally taught. Edith argued that Christianity has been a dominant belief system for over 2,000 years. John responded by pointing out that the Egyptians worshipped Isis for even longer. And the Sumerians once revered Ishtar. In India, sacred cows have roamed freely as embodiments of reincarnated souls, but in 1,000 years, ended up on the barbecue. Art asked how his name became Jesus, and what about the stories of him raising the dead. John replied that he had called himself John, he almost always had. As tales of his resurrection began to spread, his name became confused with the Hebrew Yachanan, meaning, God is gracious. Over time, his presence on earth was interpreted as divine proof of immortality, which evolved into Yahshua, meaning God is salvation. Through translation, the name shifted, first into late Greek as Isis, then into Latin as Jesus, and eventually became Jesus in medieval Latin. As for the miracles, John admitted he had done a little healing using Eastern medicine he had picked up during his travels, but nothing more. Dan explained that the story of the three wise men actually originated as a myth surrounding the birth of the Buddha. Hearing all of this, Edith began to cry, overwhelmed by the implications. Seeing her distress, Dr. Gruber became visibly angry. Convinced that John was fabricating everything, he demanded John to stop, saying he had gone too far and was now upsetting everyone in the room. Realizing that his story was deeply upsetting everyone, John, out of guilt, finally admitted he had been lying and making it all up. The room was stunned. Many had started to genuinely believe him. John insisted it was just a story. This only made things worse as his friends became angry. He tried to explain that the idea actually came from them. Edith had remarked on his unchanging appearance and the fake Van Gogh painting. Dan had noticed the ancient burin. And others had made similar comments. That sparked the notion, so he decided to test their reactions. But he admitted he had taken it too far. After all, he had the perfect audience. An anthropologist, an archaeologist, a Christian literalist, and a psychiatrist. One by one, his friends grew upset and began to leave. But Sandy lingered. She wasn't convinced. She knew John too well. He wasn't someone who would toy with people or take advantage of their goodwill and intelligence. She didn't believe John was lying because if he was, nothing else could explain his sudden and unexplained decision to leave. She asked him what his real name was. John replied that it had always been John, though his last name changed over the centuries. John Paley, John Savage, even about 60 years ago when he taught at Harvard, he went by the unusual name John Thomas Partee. As the two of them spoke in private, Will, who had stayed behind, overheard the name John Partee. He froze. That was the name of his father, a man who had abandoned his family 6 decades ago. Being stunned, Will asked John if he had once taught chemistry. Seeing Will's reaction, John realized the truth that Will is his son. They spoke briefly about Will's mother, Nola. Will struggled to believe it. In a final test, he asked John the name of their old dog. Without hesitation, John answered, Woofy. Overcome with emotion, Will broke down in tears. His father had left when he was just a baby. The shock was too much for his aging body. He suffered a heart attack and died in John's arms. After Will's body was taken away, John quietly got into his truck, leaving behind the last 10 years of his life, along with yet another painful goodbye. If you enjoyed the video, hit like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.